With the grand re-reveal of Final Fantasy XVI arriving in the not too distant future, we are beyond excited to learn about what this new vision of Final Fantasy will look like. But until then, with so much still unknown about Final Fantasy XVI in terms of its story, its gameplay and its presentation elements, all we can do is speculate about elements that we'd like to see included. So with that in mind, here are 7 things we'd like to see in Final Fantasy XVI. Based on what has been revealed so far, we know that Clive Rossfield will be the game's protagonist, and that he will be playable before and after the narrative timeskip. But what's not known is whether Clive will have any meaningful companions that will join him on his quest. The notion of a party has been a fundamental part of the Final Fantasy franchise ever since its inception, with very few single-player entries ever being created. Dissidia was even evolved from its focus on one-on-one combat to adopt this design principle, and even though more modern entries have consigned players to controlling only one character, the party has still been a focal point. Within the Final Fantasy XVI footage we've seen so far, there's been a clear focus on presenting Clive as the focal point, but this could have been an intentional marketing ploy so that the focus was, well, placed on Clive. We have seen in the past that Square Enix has often introduced the main protagonist first, only introducing the supporting cast once a suitable period of time has passed. The reveal trailer for Final Fantasy XIII, for example, only featured Lightning during its combat sequences. On top of that, it was believed that Lightning was just a development codename, and that the real name of the protagonist would be revealed at a later date. For Final Fantasy XVI, even if the player is locked to using Clive as the playable character, similar to how Final Fantasy XV was at launch, it would still be great if there were other permanent party members that could join along the way. But there's also the distinct possibility that we may instead be able to recruit either randomly generated or fixed allies that could be expendable. This would make quite a lot of sense given how much influence the work of Yasumi Matsuno has had on key development figures, with Tactics Ogre and Final Fantasy Tactics adopting systems that allowed the player to recruit important story characters to fight alongside the main protagonist, as well as randomly generated characters. A similar approach was taken in Dragon's Dogma, an important property, as Ryota Suzuki, who it's believed is the battle director of Final Fantasy XVI, was the lead game designer on that game. It had the pawn system, which included a main pawn that would be similar to a retainer, with the player able to choose their name, appearance and equipment, amongst other things, as well as hired pawns and wandering pawns. And one of the most important aspects of these systems is that people could be missed, either through not encountering them or by them not surviving recruitment scenarios. This then plays into the second thing we'd like to see: meaningful side quests. Final Fantasy games have contained side quests for a very long time, and they have manifested in different ways, often used as a method of acquiring ultimate weapons or uncovering more nuanced parts of the narrative. But in the past few iterations, even though the intentions have been clear and they did deliver on some aspects, many side quests ended up feeling quite stale, not able to hide the fact that they were there as a way of padding out the game. As a result, very few felt natural as part of progression, and there was limited connection with the main story, something that compounded the issue as there was limited reward from both a narrative or gameplay perspective for undertaking what were often rather monotonous and repetitive tasks. With Final Fantasy XVI, the hope is that this changes in a significant manner. If side quests are going to be present, there should be meaning behind their inclusion so that players don't feel penalised for having their attention diverted. And if this means only a handful are made, that's alright, because a handful of well-crafted and memorable side quests are better than 10 to 20 tedious side quests that are only memorable for the wrong reasons. This could come in the form of some very interesting narrative exposition or some amazing rewards, but the most important aspect is that the types of activities required to complete the side quests should be unique wherever possible. As an extension to this, one of the more prominent distractions over the past 3 decades has been random superbosses and the more structured alternative, hunts of increasing difficulty. Superbosses have been associated with Final Fantasy games since 1987, but it wasn't until Final Fantasy V that they would become a purposeful part of the experience. Final Fantasy X then upped the ante a bit by introducing the Monster Arena, the Dark Aeons, and Penance, but it wouldn't be until Final Fantasy XII that we would gain access to hunts. This would manifest as a series of side quests that required the player to hunt numerous marks for NPCs as well as elite marks. There would be numerous rewards on offer as well as small pieces of narrative exposition, but the main reward was satisfaction, especially after defeating foes like Yizmat. Final Fantasy XIII would feature a similar concept in the Seath Stones, with Final Fantasy XIV and XV also featuring hunts, before the Final Fantasy VII Remake introduced the VR simulator. And based on the success of this particular line of side quest, as well as the appearance of each game's respective superbosses that are either separate or appear as the conclusion of the hunt path, we expect to see hunts and superbosses return in Final Fantasy XVI. The New Game Plus concept has been around for a very long time, with Square's own Chrono Trigger coining the term when it released back in 1995, but Final Fantasy games have seldom leaned into this method of keeping players engaged, at least within their original incarnations. Final Fantasy XII, for example, had New Game Plus added when the International Zodiac Job system released, and it was patched into Final Fantasy XV post-launch. But other games like Final Fantasy X-2, Crisis Core, and more recently, the Final Fantasy VII Remake have included the feature at launch, and with Final Fantasy XVI replicating the VII Remake by having multiple difficulty options, it would make sense for this feature to be present as well. Many players also felt that playing the VII Remake on hard, which only unlocked after the regular campaign had been completed, enabled them to gain a deeper understanding of the game's mechanics and the nuances associated to each of the characters' playstyles. And given that Final Fantasy XVI looks to be doubling down on more action-orientated gameplay, it could lead to a similar scenario. On top of New Game Plus, it would also be great if there was some kind of challenge mode included. It could be used to mix things up, introducing new types of enemies throughout the playthrough, as well as new patterns for the bosses. The topic of character progression has always been quite an interesting one when it comes to Final Fantasy, as each game almost always introduces a brand new system. Some have allowed for a high degree of flexibility, encouraging players to develop each character however they see fit, while others have made things a bit more structured. In relation to Final Fantasy XVI, at this stage, all we know is that according to Yoshida, who was speaking at the 2021 Tokyo Game Show, it will feature an expansive skill tree system. But that could mean anything, especially as we don't even know if there are going to be different party members. What we're looking for though is a system that has a certain amount of structure, with players able to augment that structure to create minor deviations as opposed to wholesale ones. This will be similar to the progression seen within the game like the Final Fantasy VII Remake, where players had complete freedom to equip materia and weapons, but were restricted to using core moves associated with each character. This would allow players to be able to directly impact their stats, the magic they could use, as well as more nuanced gameplay options, while still having the way each character played feel unique. If Clive does end up being the only playable character, then it would make sense that the skill tree relate to the various icon powers that it looks like he can inherit. This could fulfill the same function, as Clive would always have default actions irrespective of the icon powers acquired, but players would then have the choice to decide how they wanted to enhance Clive's gameplay to suit their individual playstyles. Now, many people have been drawn into the Final Fantasy franchise thanks to its sweeping narratives that focus around compelling characters and the struggles they face when attempting to save their respective worlds from certain annihilation. But one of the details that's often overlooked is the secondary and tertiary storytelling elements that can help to enrich the narrative and provide extra layers of depth to those who wish to become more invested in the world. Final Fantasy X did this in expert fashion, as the developers made Spira feel lived in. There were numerous factions and races, each with their own motivations, and it always felt like the events that were taking place actually had an impact on the people you met. Effort was also placed around making the various locations a crucial part of the narrative, with hidden details strewn throughout that would encourage players to ask questions and seek out answers. This was something that Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story also did very well, with Final Fantasy XII even having thousands upon thousands of lines of optional dialogue attributed to NPCs found throughout the game's various locations. And in more recent times, we've seen this with Final Fantasy XV and the Pitios Ruins, which told many a story without using any words, something that encouraged numerous fans to come up with lavish theories as to what story the ruins were trying to tell. With the world of Valisthea featuring so many different landmarks, regions and kingdoms, we can only hope that similar care is taken when it comes to building out a compelling narrative around the world itself that helps to support everything, and using the various environments themselves could end up being crucial to this, especially when factoring in how the game deals with the passage of time. And that brings us on to the last thing we'd like to see, tasteful allusions to the past. Even though they're all unconfirmed at this point, it already feels like there have been so many tasteful allusions to Ivalice within what's been revealed about Final Fantasy XVI so far. But what we're hoping for is a game that doesn't rely too heavily on the past and only uses it in a tasteful and meaningful way. By that, we mean that Final Fantasy XVI should have a strong enough world to be able to stand on its own 2 feet, with Final Fantasy hallmarks then integrated in a way that doesn't detract from the world that's being created. And we'd like to hope that the development team are strong enough to not include elements that just don't make sense within the world they're building. We've already seen that the crystals will play a big part and that summons will return, as well as the famed Malbra, but what we'd like to see is balance. For example, it'd be great to see some new icons introduced that we've never seen before, as opposed to just relying on the existing roster, and that notion relates to everything, from the bestiary through to equipment sets and even wider recurring elements such as Gilgamesh. The good thing is that through their work on Final Fantasy XIV, Creative Business Unit 3 has already shown that they can navigate this aspect of development pretty well. We just hope that it carries over to their work on Final Fantasy XVI and that fan service doesn't supersede their own creative vision. Thank you for watching the video, everyone. Be sure to let us know in the comments below what you'd like to see in Final Fantasy XVI, and if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Alright, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Anthony Hoffman, Benjamin Snow, the livestream and Gregory, who are super special Onion Knight supporters. And of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.